Welcome to this hands-on introduction to Docker series. In this first episode we're going to talk about what is Docker and how to install it on Windows and Linux. So what is Docker? I'm going to start off by giving you an example, and let's assume that you are a developer and that you have an application and you want to provision that application. Normally you would go out and spin up a virtual machine and tweak it for your application. Now this has a few downsides. So the first downside is of course that it's not that easy to set up and that it requires quite some resources, right? It requires RAM and CPU and it's very hard to replicate. Docker makes provisioning applications very easy. It's very easy to set up a Docker container with your application and the right configuration that you can deploy on any machine independent of the operating system. Of course, another benefit of Docker is that it is very easy to segregate different applications. So for example, you have a web app that runs a Postgres DB and a Redis caching layer. You can spin each component in a different container, which helps with implementing the single responsibility principle. And that has a lot of benefits. It's very easy to detect issues if you have issues with the Postgres or Redis. And in real life, you're not going to have everything on one server. You are going to have multiple Postgres instances, for example, and you can do this with Docker. So basically it's much easier to simulate a real life environment and see that everything works. Looking at this diagram, we can see on the left side how virtual machines are set up. We basically have a hypervisor on top of our operating system that runs guest OSs that run our application. So this requires a lot of resources to have another operating system on top of your host operating system. While on the right side we can see that this is very simplified. We have our applications running on top of the Docker daemon that runs on top or perhaps in parallel with the host operating system. And basically we are going to interact with the Docker daemon using the Docker client. This daemon is going to take care of all of our applications and the resources they're consuming as well as networking. Next, I'm going to show you how to install the Docker engine on Windows and Ubuntu. So first we're going to head to the Docker docs. If you want to learn a great deal about Docker, I recommend you check out the docs. They're very well written. But right here we have the installation guide for Ubuntu, and the first step we're going to do is uninstall the older Docker version. So basically if we run this command, and we let it run for a bit, the old versions are uninstalled. Next I'm going to install it using the apt repository. So basically after you do your sudo apt get update, and we're going to install curl and the certificates. So we're going to let it run. It's going to run for a little bit. After it's done, we're going to install key rings basically, and we're going to get the Docker repository. And of course give right permissions to the docker.asc file. And now we're going to update the apt sources. And don't worry, you might get an error when you run sudo apt get update. In this case, no error. Finally, we're going to install the Docker engine, and you're going to have to wait for it to run. Now that everything is done, you are going to be able to write sudo docker version, and you should get this output. The server should be up as well as the client. Now on the side you're going to see that there is some post-installation steps for Linux that I recommend you might take, and I'm going to use this manage Docker as a non-root user. There are a couple of other steps, but I'm only going to add this one. So I'm going to just copy the commands and paste them into the terminal. And now I should be able to run Docker version. And I get the same output. I don't need to run sudo anymore. Next, I'm going to show you how to install Docker on Windows. Open your favorite browser and write Docker for Windows. Click on the first link, and then you're going to have to make a choice. Do you want to install Docker on top of WSL or on top of Hyper-V? There are different system requirements and you have to choose. In this episode I'm going to go for WSL. Scroll down to the release notes and I'm going to pick the latest version. Now that it has downloaded successfully, we're going to run the application and we're going to get a very common prompt. If you ever installed an application on Windows, you are going to be familiar with it. Here it is, the Docker installer. And you're going to let it run. I don't want to add a shortcut. And installation succeeded. Now if we run Docker desktop, the Docker engine should start up any second now. We're going to accept the terms and services, and I'm going to open a privileged command prompt. I'm going to just skip. We can see that the Docker engine is starting. Now the engine is running and we can run Docker version and we see the same output, just like we saw on Linux. We have successfully installed Docker for Windows and Linux.